Over the course of the past few weeks, we've been taking a closer look at the story of Joseph. Joseph, of course, being one of the youngest sons of the great patriarch Jacob, whose story is told in the final chapters of the book of Genesis. In the last Bible study, we learned about how Joseph was sold by his very own brothers, then taken to Egypt, where he would be forced to work for the rest of his life, essentially, as a slave. Now, surprisingly, things go well for Joseph in Egypt, at least initially anyway. He earns the trust of his new Egyptian master Potiphar, and he's given a lot of responsibility, not to mention a lot of respect in Potiphar's household. But sadly, Joseph's luck doesn't last. Eventually, he finds himself once again betrayed. And today, we're going to take a closer look at the way in which Joseph is betrayed while living with Potiphar in Egypt. This is a fascinating story from Genesis chapter 39, one with some very interesting New Testament parallels, some interesting connections with Jesus, and you'll see that as we explore this passage of scripture further. One thing though before I begin, if this Bible study was helpful to you in your walk of faith, please leave a like, and if you want more from Stone Church, more services, more sermons, more Bible studies, please subscribe. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started. So it does start off 39 verses 1 to 6. Now, Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And with him there, he had no concern for anything but the food he ate. All right. So when Joseph is sold into slavery, he's immediately bought by a person of tremendous significance. This man named Potiphar, who's a high-ranking officer in the military. And we're told that, and I quote, "the Lord was with Joseph." And I think that's really what sets Joseph apart, the fact that the Lord is with him. That's what sets him apart from his brothers, that's for sure. And it's also what sets him apart from everyone else in Egypt, which of course isn't to say that God is abandoning everybody and only there for Joseph. But I guess you could say that God's hand is on Joseph in a special way, and he's with Joseph in a way that he's not with others, okay? And I think this point is really strongly emphasized by the author of this story. And you'll notice that in those few verses of Scripture, the phrase "the Lord" pops up, I think at least 6 times. It says, and I quote, "the Lord was with Joseph," and then later on, "his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands." So Joseph is so successful, because the Lord is with him, Joseph is so successful that his master Potiphar basically puts him in charge of everything in the house. He makes him lord of the estate. And I think that's a pattern in Joseph's whole story arc. The Lord is with Joseph, therefore Joseph succeeds in everything that he does, and that success allows him to attain these high positions of responsibility wherever he goes. So here we're told again, he's put in charge of Potiphar's estate, and later on, we'll see how something similar happens when Joseph is put in prison. In fact, that seems to be a thread, I think, throughout the entire Old Testament, not just with Joseph, but with the Jews in general, right? And you'll read throughout the Old Testament, there are all these stories of individual Jews rising to positions of authority in the civil service of different empires. So to just pick one example, there's Daniel, right? Daniel Another dreamer successfully interprets the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar, and we're told, and I quote, that the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men in Babylon. Sounds like Joseph. Later on, when the Jews are living as exiles in Persia, Mordecai rises to prominence in the king's court after he discovers an assassination plot against the king, right? So, in this way, the Jews actually bless the nations where they're forced to live as captives. There's this beautiful verse in the book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare."
Who said that?
That's a Jeremiah. Yeah, Jeremiah 28:7. Okay? So, whilst the Jews are sent by God into exile as punishment, right? That punishment, weirdly enough, allows them to live out the calling of Father Abraham. Because remember what God said to Abraham at the beginning in the book of Genesis 12, I think it is. He says, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you," this is the important part, "all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And we see that happening in the Bible as the Jews go into exile, and we also see it happening here with Joseph. He's in exile, as it were. He's away from his homeland. He's living with Potiphar, and he is a huge blessing to Potiphar and his household. But he's got a tough road ahead of him, Joseph, and we'll read what happens to him next. Now, Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. All right. So the author establishes that Joseph is, and I quote, "handsome and good looking." Potiphar's wife recognizes this. She, quote, "cast her eyes on Joseph." And next she seeks to seduce him, saying, "Lie with me." So in doing so, of course, Potiphar's wife certainly does something very unethical. She sins, right? I find it neat that this pattern of coveting, of desiring something, and then following that desire with sin, that's a pattern that I see throughout the scriptures. Just to give you a couple examples, in the book of Genesis, the woman recognizes that the fruit is good to eat, so basically she covets it, she wants it, and then she follows that coveting with the act of eating the fruit and actually sinning. Another example, 2 Samuel. King David is looking out on his palace and he sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof of her house. He recognizes her beauty, and soon after that, he summons Bathsheba to the palace where he has intercourse with her. And I think a case could be made that basically he sexually assaults her, he rapes her, right? So coveting then followed by the actual concrete sin itself. But Joseph, in this story, refuses the advances of Mrs. Potiphar, and he bases his refusal on the fact that God basically has entrusted him with everything. Potiphar has, quote, "put everything that he has in my hand." So if Joseph were to sleep with this woman, he would be performing the ultimate act of betrayal on a man who's placed enormous trust in him. Yeah, again, Potiphar said, "Look, you're the boss in my house as far as I'm concerned, except for me, right? I'm giving you authority over everything." It would be a huge, he would really be taking advantage of that trust, obviously, if he were to go, be seduced by his wife. I think in this respect, Joseph is definitely different from the character of King David. Because I want you to think about it. In a similar way, God gives David charge over his nation and over his house. This is what God says to King David. I anointed you king over Israel and rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Right? So God has entrusted David with so much, and yet David still covets the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, and takes advantage of her. But not so Joseph. Joseph is a man of greater character. Okay, Joseph is not like King David. He's also not like Dustin Hoffman's character in The Graduate. Remember that movie? Um, Joseph's refusal to engage in sexual intercourse with Potiphar's wife establishes him as a man of nobility and integrity, right? He will not sin against God. He certainly won't sin against God in the way that King David does with his adultery. At any rate, Mrs. Potiphar will not take no for an answer, so let's read on. Let's read about what happens next. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, Lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. It looks like Mrs. Potiphar has premeditated this crime, so you'll notice that she waits for a moment when she knows that she and Joseph are going to be alone in the house together. This kind of reminds me of what happened in that earlier incident with Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers also schemed together before they committed their crime. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. So just as Joseph's brothers have this plot to murder Joseph, Potiphar's wife has this plot, I guess, with herself. She has this internal dialogue, I think, where she seeks to seduce him. We are told that she caught hold of his garment. Interesting. Notice the word garment in these verses is used a total of 6 times. I think that's a matter of significance. And I think it's clearly important to the story. You'll remember, too, Joseph's brothers seized his garment, his coat of many colors, and they stripped him of his robe before they threw him into the cistern, right? Anyway, again, Joseph resists the advances of this woman, and he establishes once again he's a man of character, he's a man of integrity. He also reminds me, too, of Tom Robinson from To Kill a Mockingbird. You'll remember that character from the novel, he is also kind of low down on the social hierarchy in his society. He's a black man living in one of the southern states, and he is seduced by a woman, and he refuses her advances. Joseph, however, in the process of running away from Potiphar's wife, leaves quote-unquote proof of the crime that he would later be accused of. Notice that Joseph's brothers use his blood-smeared robe as evidence of Joseph's death and therefore of their innocence. So in that whole episode, they use Joseph's coat as a way of demonstrating a wild animal killed him, we had nothing to do with it. And in the same way, Potiphar's wife uses Joseph's cloak, his garment, as proof of her innocence and proof of Joseph's guilt. And you'll notice right away, Potiphar's wife calls for witnesses, and she immediately attempts to establish that she's the innocent victim, that Joseph is the aggressor. I suppose that she could have potentially dropped the incident and hoped that Joseph wouldn't tell her husband about what she did. But instead, Potiphar accuses Joseph of rape. Now, why is that? It could be because she's cruel and vindictive. We know that she's not exactly a woman of exceptional character. But it also could be she just doesn't want to get into any trouble, right? If she figures that Joseph might tell her husband about what happened, then she knows that she could potentially get into big trouble. So she concocts this story about her being the victim of a crime. But we'll keep going. Genesis 39:16-20. Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. Okay, I want you to notice that when the woman speaks to her husband, she sounds strikingly like Adam when he was confronted with eating the fruit, right? Remember what Adam said? Adam said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate." Like Adam, Potiphar's wife is trying to foist blame not only upon Joseph, but upon her husband as well. He, after all, was the one who brought this Hebrew slave into the household in the first place. And it's like she's saying, none of this would have happened if it weren't for you. And we're told that when Potiphar hears what his wife has to say, he is enraged. When Potiphar hears this, he's enraged. Now, the question that I wrestled with in this story is, who is he enraged at? Is Potiphar angry at Joseph, or is he angry with his wife? What do you think? I think the case can be made, though, that Potiphar is actually angry with his wife. And here's my line of reasoning behind it. He obviously trusts Joseph, because if he didn't trust Joseph, he wouldn't have given Joseph charge over his entire estate. So it seems like he thinks Joseph is a man of great character. Okay? And if you think about it further, if Potiphar really did believe that Joseph was making a move on his wife, he wouldn't just have him thrown in jail, would he? I think he would have probably killed him. He certainly had the power to do that. He was a very high-ranking military official. He was a general. He could have had Joseph instantly killed if he wanted to, but that's not what Potiphar does. But then again, Potiphar, it's not as if Potiphar can just do nothing about the whole situation at all, because if that's the case, then his wife would be humiliated by the situation and he would be humiliated by the situation as well. So he has to act in such a way that saves face, but I don't think he actually wants to kill Joseph, okay? So the best way for him to save face without killing Joseph is to put him in jail. And it sounds like this is a decent jail. It sounds like this is like a minimum security jail. I don't know, right? So this part of the story ends with Joseph being put in jail. And here I think we see another striking parallel between this episode, so the one involving Potiphar, and the earlier episode of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. Okay, so let's follow some of those parallel points again. In Genesis 37, Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. He's stripped of his garment and thrown into a pit. Here in Genesis chapter 39, Joseph is betrayed by Potiphar's wife, stripped of his garment, and thrown into jail. So do you see those parallels right there? And just as Joseph's wife fabricates a story involving Joseph's garment so as to cover her crime, so too do the brothers. They do the same thing. Now, this brings us to the New Testament connection. I think you can also see some really interesting parallels here with Jesus. Parallels between Jesus and Joseph. Okay? So just as Joseph was betrayed by his brother's and master's wife, Jesus is betrayed by his brother, Judas. Not literally his brother, but still, right? One of his disciples. And he's abandoned by his friends. Just as Joseph is stripped of his garments, so too is Jesus stripped of his garments. Just as Joseph is thrown into a pit by his brothers or into jail by Potiphar, Jesus is thrown into the tomb. And just as Joseph will eventually ascend to this position of a tremendous authority in Potiphar's household, or in jail, or in the court of Pharaoh, so too does Jesus ascend to the right hand of God, where he's ultimately glorified, right? So, interesting parallels right there. One last thing I want to look at. I want to look at chapter 39, verses 21 to 23. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. All right. This is interesting now. It's obvious that verses 21 to 23, which describes Joseph's life in jail, that stuff that happens to him in jail precisely mirrors what happens to him in verses 1 to 6, so Potiphar's household. Okay, so in both settings, whether Potiphar's household or jail, we are told that, number one, God was with Joseph. Number two, he finds favor with his earthly masters. 3, he's put in charge of everything. And 4, he does his job so well that his earthly masters don't have to worry about anything. One thing, though, I think needs to be made clear here, it's that 2, 3, and 4 only happen as a result of number 1. Number 1 being God was with Joseph, right? And again, that's what distinguishes Joseph from everyone else in the story. God is with Joseph in a special way. God's finger is on Joseph in a special way. Okay? So in short, Joseph is the one through whom God will work in order to bring about his good will. And God's will is this, that the children of Jacob, the children of Israel, thrive and multiply. That's God's ultimate plan. But they can't do so if they're consumed by famine. Okay, because you'll remember back in the land of Israel, a famine is eventually going to come. So what God does is he raises up Joseph. He is with Joseph in such a way that Joseph can bring his brothers to a place of plenty where the Jews can thrive and grow as a people. Okay? Again, the similarities with Jesus abound. Jesus is the instrument through which God accomplishes his goal and purpose for the rest of humanity. And just as Israel is saved by Joseph and Joseph's betrayal and suffering and reign, so too is all of humanity saved by Jesus' betrayal and suffering and reign. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now. But next week we'll continue and we'll find out what happens to Joseph while he's in prison.